The mess hall at Fort Hamilton was always alive at noon, a boiling pot of voices, trays clattering, and boots scraping across the tiled floor. Soldiers in fatigues filed in through the wide double doors in a constant stream, some laughing loudly with their buddies, others moving with the silence of exhaustion. The room smelled of cafeteria food, fried chicken, gravy, powdered mashed potatoes, and coffee that was strong enough to burn through steel. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, bouncing off polished steel counters and long rows of tables bolted to the ground. It was noisy, busy, and unremarkable, just another day in the life of America's fighting men and women. But at a quiet corner near the far wall, away from the chaos of the crowd, sat a woman who did not quite belong to the noise. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Blake moved with an ease that only came from years of discipline. She wasn't the type to draw attention, nor did she want it. She had chosen the far end of the mess hall deliberately, back against the wall, eyes on the exits, a habit she'd never lost from deployments. She sat with her tray of food, eating calmly, deliberately, every movement efficient. Her brown hair was pulled into a neat bun at the nape of her neck, and her fatigues bore nothing unusual. No flashy ribbons, no oversaturated patches, nothing to betray who she really was. If anyone had looked closely, they might have noticed how still she sat, how her eyes occasionally swept the room in quick, practiced glances, or how she always shifted slightly when someone passed too close to her. But most soldiers didn't notice her. She looked like any other officer taking a break. And that was exactly how she wanted it. Sarah Blake was not any other officer. Behind the quiet eyes and calm demeanor was a Navy SEAL, one of the first women to ever pass through Bud S, the brutal training course that chewed up and spat out even the strongest men. She had served in hot zones across the globe, Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, places where every step could be your last. Her reputation inside the SEAL community was one of resilience and steel. Outside, however, very few knew her name. And she liked it that way. Recognition meant questions. Attention meant people trying to measure her against their own insecurities. Sarah had long since grown tired of that game. So she sat, quietly eating, ignoring the noise, letting herself disappear into the background. On the far side of the mess hall, a group of young soldiers entered, their laughter cutting through the room like knives scraping a plate. They were new, their uniforms still crisp, their boots too clean, their energy restless. 4 of them, all about the same age, maybe 19 or 20. They carried themselves with the swagger of men who had been told they were warriors, but had yet to test the truth of it. Private First Class Daniels led the pack. Tall, lean, with close-cropped blonde hair and a grin that came too easily. Daniels was the kind of soldier who thought his charm could carry him through anything. He walked with his chin high, speaking loudly so everyone nearby could hear him. Beside him were Privates Lopez, Harris, and Miller, his shadow crew, who laughed at his jokes and copied his bravado. The 4 moved through the line, piling food onto their trays, jostling each other, cracking jokes that earned groans from the kitchen staff. Their voices carried across the room, drawing annoyed glances from older soldiers who had seen enough of that cockiness before. But the younger crowd seemed amused. Daniels always knew how to draw attention, and he thrived on it. Trays loaded, the 4 scanned the room for a place to sit. Most of the tables were full, clusters of soldiers talking over their meals. Daniels's eyes swept across the room and landed on Sarah. There she was, alone at the end of the hall, head down, quietly eating as though the noise around her didn't exist. To Daniels, it was like spotting an abandoned chair at a poker table, an easy mark. "Check it out," he muttered to his buddies, tilting his head toward Sarah. "New face. Navy, looks like. Sitting all alone." Lopez grinned. Probably fresh out of training. Doesn't know anybody. Or shy, Harris added with a smirk. Miller chuckled. Shy Navy girl at an Army base? Guess she picked the wrong place to hide. Daniels smirked, the decision already made. Come on, boys. Let's go give her a warm welcome. The four of them moved like a pack, trays in hand, weaving through the tables until they reached Sarah's corner. Their voices grew louder as they approached, deliberately so. Soldiers at nearby tables glanced up, already sensing the energy shift. Sarah noticed them long before they reached her. She always noticed. Her eyes flicked up once, briefly, then back to her tray. She didn't stiffen. She didn't react. She simply continued eating, calm as ever. The soldiers reached her table. Daniel set his tray down with a loud clack, the sound echoing against the table. His friends followed suit, sitting on either side of her, effectively boxing her in. Daniels leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, flashing his trademark grin. Well, well, he drawled. Haven't seen you around before. You new here? Sarah looked up at him slowly, her expression unreadable. She didn't answer right away, just studied his face, then returned her gaze to her food. Her silence seemed to fuel him. Daniels grinned wider. Come on now, don't be shy. What's your name? Lopez snorted. She's Navy, right? Got that look? Yeah, Harris added, chuckling. Navy girl at an Army base. Wonder if she knows what she's in for. The four of them laughed, their voices carrying across the hall. A couple of soldiers nearby shook their heads, muttering under their breath. Nobody stepped in. They all knew how these things went. Sarah kept eating, unbothered, every movement precise. But her silence wasn't fear. It was patience. And as Daniels leaned closer, smirk plastered on his face. The trap he was setting was one he didn't even realize he had walked into. The clatter of trays, the steady hum of conversations, and the occasional bark of laughter filled the mess hall. Soldiers came and went, but one corner of the room had shifted. Not everyone noticed, but those who had sat long enough in barracks, training fields, or foreign deployments knew the change in the air. It was subtle, but it was there. 4 young Army soldiers had boxed in the woman sitting at the far end. At first, it seemed like nothing, just a group of rowdy privates choosing a random seat. But their posture, the way they leaned in toward her, the laughter a shade too loud, drew glances from a few who had seen this type of scene unfold before. Sarah Blake kept her expression neutral. She had been in tighter corners than this, corners that involved gunfire, burning debris, and men who wanted her dead. Compared to that, 4 cocky soldiers with more ego than experience barely registered as a threat. Still, her instincts remained sharp. Her eyes flicked to each one in turn. Daniels, leaning forward with too much confidence. Lopez, the smirking sidekick. Harris, wide-eyed and restless. And Miller, the quiet one trying too hard to laugh. Daniels, sensing he had an audience, dropped his voice low enough to seem personal, but kept it loud enough for others nearby to catch pieces of it. So, you Navy? Don't see many of you around here. He raised his eyebrows, pretending charm but dripping with mockery. Sarah didn't bite. She speared another forkful of food, chewed slowly, and kept her gaze on the tray. Her calm was deliberate. She wasn't going to give them the reaction they wanted. Lopez chuckled, elbowing Harris. Bet she's one of those desk Navy types. Pushes paper all day. Harris snorted. Or maybe she's a medic. You know, the ones that can't handle the real stuff. The laughter grew louder. Sarah finally lifted her eyes, not to answer, but to look at them, really look. Her gaze was steady, cold but calm, like still water with unknown depths. Daniels felt a flicker of something in his chest, but buried it quickly under his grin. "You don't talk much, do you?" he pressed. "Don't worry. We're friendly. Just trying to make sure you're not lost." The joke landed weakly, but his buddies laughed anyway. Sarah's voice came then, soft but even. "I'm fine where I am." The four froze for half a heartbeat, not expecting her to respond at all. Her tone wasn't sharp, wasn't defensive. It was controlled, unbothered. Daniels forced a smirk to cover the slip in confidence. "Fine, huh?" He dragged her tray a few inches toward him with the edge of his hand. "Looks like you could use some company. Mess hall gets lonely otherwise." That move earned louder laughter from his crew. Lopez leaned in, adding, "Yeah, don't want you sitting here all sad and quiet. We're good company." Sarah's hand stopped midway to her fork. Slowly, she looked at Daniels, her dark eyes meeting his. Her voice was calm, almost casual. "Put it back." The three words cut through the laughter like a knife. Daniels paused, grin faltering for just a fraction of a second. The silence that followed was noticeable, enough for nearby soldiers to glance again. Lopez broke it with a scoff. "Man, she's serious." He leaned back, trying to fan the flames. Daniels recovered quickly, smirking wider. "Relax, we're just messing around." But instead of returning the tray, he pushed it another inch closer to himself. Sarah's eyes didn't leave his. Her face was expressionless, but her gaze carried weight. She repeated, softer but sharper, "Put it back." The tension thickened. The laughter from the group died down a little, replaced by nervous grins. They had expected playful resistance, not an icy warning. But Daniels doubled down, unwilling to lose face. "Come on, sweetheart," he said, voice louder now, drawing more attention from nearby tables. "We're all on the same team here. No need to get." The words cut off when Sarah finally set her fork down. The sound was quiet, but the way she moved was deliberate, like the pause before a storm. She leaned back slightly, giving herself space, and spoke with the kind of calm that made every syllable heavier. "You don't want to finish that sentence." Lopez blinked, his grin fading. Harris shifted uncomfortably in his chair, eyes darting around as if suddenly aware that more people were watching. Miller, the quietest of the four, swallowed hard but forced a chuckle. "Hey, relax, we're just joking. No harm done." But Daniels wasn't ready to back down. He had built his identity around being untouchable, always the loudest voice in the room, always the one people laughed with or at. Backing down in front of his buddies, in front of the mess hall, was unthinkable. So he leaned in closer, lowering his voice again. "Listen, Navy, we're just trying to have some fun. Don't make this a big deal." Sarah didn't move, didn't blink. She simply watched him, her silence pressing harder than words. Daniels felt the edge of unease in his chest again. Something about the way she sat, perfectly composed, shoulders relaxed, eyes steady. It was wrong. Not wrong like weak, but wrong like dangerous. He couldn't put his finger on it, but the instinct buried under his ego whispered that maybe, just maybe, he was picking on the wrong person. Lopez, sensing the pause, tried to steer it back. "So, what do you even do in the Navy anyway? You don't look like much of a fighter." Sarah's lips quirked at the faintest hint of a smile, though it was gone as quickly as it appeared. She didn't answer. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, folded her arms loosely across her chest, and looked at them all, one by one, without saying a word. The silence stretched. Around them, the mess hall seemed to slow. Conversations quieted as more soldiers noticed the standoff. Daniels felt the eyes on him and forced a laugh, trying to shrug it off. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" But even as he said it, his confidence wavered. Sarah's calm wasn't the calm of someone cornered. It was the calm of someone who had been here before, not in mess halls, but in places far darker, where arrogance wasn't just embarrassing, it was fatal. Harris shifted again, tugging at his sleeve, whispering under his breath, "Maybe we should chill, man." But Daniels wasn't listening. He had committed now. His pride, his image in front of his crew, and the watching eyes demanded he keep going. And Sarah Blake, still silent, knew exactly what was about to happen. Because arrogance always pushed too far. And when it did, she would end it. The atmosphere inside the mess hall had changed. The laughter, the clatter of trays, the easy rhythm of lunchtime chatter, all of it seemed to dull as the standoff at the corner table dragged on. A few soldiers, old enough to recognize trouble when they saw it, glanced sidelong but said nothing. Young soldiers always tested boundaries, and every once in a while they tested the wrong ones. At Sarah Blake's table, 4 young Army privates were learning that lesson, though they didn't yet realize it. Daniels, cocky as ever, leaned forward with a smirk plastered across his face. He wasn't about to let a quiet Navy officer, a woman no less, undermine his bravado in front of his buddies. His tray sat half-eaten in front of him, but he wasn't hungry. His appetite now was for dominance. "You know, sweetheart," he said, his voice carrying just enough to draw more ears. "In the Army, we like to stick together. Watch each other's backs. Guess the Navy didn't teach you that." His words earned chuckles from Lopez and Miller. Harris laughed too, but it sounded more forced, like he wasn't sure whether he wanted to be part of this anymore. Sarah didn't flinch. Her fork moved steadily, her chewing unhurried. The only sign she had even heard him was the slight lift of her eyes, those calm, unwavering eyes that seemed to see right through him. She didn't need to speak. Her silence pressed heavier than a dozen cutting remarks could have. But Daniels wasn't finished. He wanted to see a crack. He needed to see it. So with deliberate arrogance, he reached across the table and slid her tray closer to himself, scraping it against the metal surface with a screech that turned heads. He picked up her biscuit with his fingers and took a bite, grinning wide as crumbs fell. "There we go," he said around a mouthful. "You weren't eating that anyway." A ripple of laughter erupted from Lopez and Miller, though Harris only stared, uneasy. Sarah's hand stopped mid-reach for her coffee. Her eyes lifted, locking onto Daniels. This time she spoke, voice low and even. "Put it back." The command was simple, yet it silenced the laughter instantly. Daniels paused, the grin faltering for just a beat before he forced it back onto his face. "Oh, the Navy girls got some bite," Lopez teased, though his voice didn't carry the same confidence as before. "Careful, Daniels," Harris muttered under his breath, his eyes flicking to Sarah's composed expression. He couldn't shake the feeling there was something off about her, something dangerous beneath that calm exterior. Daniels waved him off. "Relax, she's bluffing." He leaned closer to Sarah, so close he could smell the faint scent of coffee on her breath, and whispered, "What are you gonna do, huh? Call your captain? Cry about it?" Sarah's gaze never wavered. Her eyes were steady, her voice softer than before, but edged like a blade. "I said, put it back." For a moment, Daniels hesitated. The authority in her tone didn't sound like pleading, didn't sound like someone cornered. It sounded like someone used to being a maid, and that unnerved him. But his pride wouldn't allow him to back down. Not with his buddies watching. Not with half the mess hall, now pretending not to watch. So he leaned back, popping the rest of the biscuit into his mouth with exaggerated bravado. Too late. The laughter returned, thinner this time, but still enough to fuel his ego. Sarah's fork clinked against her tray as she set it down. Slowly, deliberately, she pushed back her chair. The scrape of metal legs against the floor seemed louder than it should have been, and the room grew quieter as soldiers turned their heads. Daniel sat back with a smirk, confident he'd rattled her. "What, you leaving already?" But Sarah didn't move to leave. She stood, hands loose at her sides, her posture relaxed, but somehow commanding. She looked down at Daniels, her face unreadable. "You boys like playing games," she said evenly. "But some games don't end the way you think." The words, calm as they were, carried weight. Daniels chuckled, trying to shake off the unease creeping up his spine. "What, you gonna teach us a lesson, Navy?" Lopez laughed nervously. "Yeah, show us what you've got." Miller forced a grin, though he shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Harris said nothing, his eyes darting between Sarah and Daniels like a man watching a fuse burn toward dynamite. Sarah didn't move. She didn't need to, not yet. She simply folded her arms, her silence stretching, pressing down on them. The mess hall was now quiet enough that the distant hum of the kitchen vents seemed louder than the soldiers' breaths. Daniels forced another laugh, leaning back in his chair. "Didn't think so." He reached for her coffee cup, planning to take a sip just to push her one step further. That was when Sarah moved. Her hand shot out, faster than anyone at the table could track. She grabbed the cup first, pulled it back, and set it down beside her. Then, with the same smooth motion, she gripped Daniel's wrist, not hard, not enough to hurt, but enough to freeze him in place. Daniel's smirk faltered. He tried to tug his hand free, but her grip was iron. Calmly, she released him and stepped back. "You should finish your meal," she said softly. The words weren't a threat. They were a warning. Daniels stared at her, rubbing his wrist. For the first time, doubt flickered in his eyes. But before he could say anything, Lopez laughed again, too loud, trying to shake off the tension. "Man, Daniels, she's got you nervous. Don't let her win." The false bravado pulled Daniels back from the edge. His pride roared louder than his instincts, and he shoved his chair back, standing. He towered over her, his smirk returning. "You think you're tough? Show us." The room fell into silence. Forks paused midway to mouths. Soldiers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Everyone could feel it, the thin lines snapping. Sarah's face didn't change. She simply looked at him, steady as ever, and replied, "Are you sure you want that?" The words sent a chill through Harris, who muttered again, "Daniels, don't." But Daniels was too far gone. He couldn't stop now, not with everyone watching. Lopez grinned, slapping the table. "Come on, Navy, let's see it." Sarah's shoulders rose and fell in a quiet sigh. Her patience had reached its limit. And in that moment, the four young soldiers had no idea that the lesson they were about to learn would follow them for the rest of their lives. The air in the mess hall thickened like a storm cloud ready to burst. A few minutes earlier, the atmosphere had been filled with harmless chatter and the metallic clink of utensils against trays. But now, all those sounds seemed to dim, as though the entire room was unconsciously holding its breath. Soldiers nearby leaned back slightly in their chairs, their eyes darting toward the table where Lieutenant Commander Sarah Blake stood face to face with four cocky young soldiers who didn't yet understand what kind of fire they had just poked. Daniels, the ringleader, leaned forward with a smirk stretched across his face. His voice was dripping with condescension. "What's a girl like you really think you're doing here?" he asked, keeping his tone low enough that only those close by could hear. But the question was sharp, meant to sting, meant to provoke. His friends broke into laughter that echoed far louder than it needed to, drawing even more attention from across the hall. Sarah had endured their taunts with the patience of someone who had been through far worse. She'd survived grueling combat deployments, stared down enemies with rifles aimed at her chest, and faced training regimens designed to break even the toughest men alive. Four immature soldiers trying to humiliate her over lunch didn't even register on the same scale of threat. Yet she also knew something dangerous, not for herself, but for them. If she let them push unchecked, they would keep pushing. Not just her, but others. That arrogance could cost them their lives in the field one day, or cost someone else theirs. Her fork clinked softly against the tray as she set it down with deliberate calmness. Slowly, Sarah pushed her chair back. The screech of metal legs dragging across the tile floor cut through the laughter like a blade. It was subtle, but every soldier nearby winced at the sound, as though they instinctively knew something irreversible was about to unfold. Sarah rose to her full height. She wasn't towering or intimidating in the conventional sense, but the way she carried herself shifted the energy instantly. Her posture was straight, shoulders squared, eyes leveled not just at Daniels, but at each of the four. There was no flinch, no hint of uncertainty. Only composure, the kind that came from years of operating in high-pressure environments where a split second could determine life or death. "You want to know what I'm doing here?" she asked softly. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, but it carried an undertone of steel that made the hairs on the back of the necks of those nearby rise. Daniels smirked, mistaking her restraint for hesitation. "Yeah," he said, drawing out the word. "I think we all do. Because you don't exactly look like you belong." His buddies snickered, emboldened by his arrogance, their eyes darting toward the growing crowd gathering to watch. The mess hall wasn't quiet anymore. It was eerily silent. Forks hovered mid-air. Conversations had died, and even those pretending not to watch had their ears tuned completely to the brewing confrontation. Sarah let a pause hang in the air, letting their words reverberate in their own heads. She studied their faces, the cocky smiles, the misplaced confidence, the bravado built on inexperience. Then she tilted her head ever so slightly, like a predator narrowing in on prey. Her eyes locked on Daniel's, and she repeated with a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes, "You really want to know what I'm doing here?" Daniels puffed out his chest, chuckling. "That's right. Show us. Prove it." He leaned back in his chair, arms spread wide in mock invitation. His friends elbowed each other, grinning, waiting for her to flinch, to back down, to give them one last laugh to brag about later. But Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't smile either. What she did was far more unsettling. She simply stood still, the calm before the storm, and the silence grew thicker. For a moment, Daniel's grin faltered. And then it happened. Sarah's hand shot forward in a blur, faster than their eyes could track. Before Daniels could even react, his wrist was twisted, his arm bent backward at an unnatural angle, and his body was forced forward until his chest slammed against the table with a loud thud. His tray rattled violently, a spoon clattering to the floor. The sound seemed to echo through the mess hall, punctuating the sudden violence of the movement. Daniels gasped, the cocky laugh ripped from his throat, replaced with a pained groan. His buddies jumped back, startled, their faces wide with shock. They hadn't even seen her move. 1 second she was standing, calm as ever, and the next their leader was pinned to the table like a ragdoll. Gasps erupted across the hall. Conversations stopped altogether. Soldiers at the far end of the room stood up from their seats, craning their necks to see what had happened. Those who had doubted earlier now realized they had underestimated the quiet woman at the table. Sarah held Daniels in place effortlessly, her grip firm but controlled. She wasn't trying to hurt him, not yet, only to demonstrate how completely she controlled the situation. His face pressed against the table, his arm twisted behind him. Daniels tried to squirm, but her hold didn't budge. Leaning slightly closer, Sarah whispered so only he and his friends could hear, "This is what I'm doing here." Her words weren't shouted, but they cut deeper than any yell could have. Daniels winced, his pride bruised more than his body, as his friends stood frozen in place, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. Their bravado had evaporated in seconds, replaced by fear and disbelief. Finally, with deliberate control, Sarah released him. Daniel stumbled back, clutching his arm, his face red not just from the pressure against the table, but from humiliation. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. The silence in the hall swallowed him whole. Sarah didn't return to her seat immediately. She stood tall, her eyes sweeping across the room, meeting the stares of the soldiers who had gathered. Her gaze wasn't threatening. It was a reminder. A message that needed no words. Respect was not optional. For a moment, no one moved. The young soldiers who had once been laughing now stood like statues, every ounce of arrogance drained from them. They realized, far too late, that they had picked the wrong target. Sarah adjusted her sleeve, her movements calm and deliberate, as though what had just happened was nothing more than brushing dust from her uniform. Then, without a word, she picked up her fork, sat down, and resumed eating, her composure unshaken. Around the hall, soldiers exchanged wide-eyed glances, whispers starting to ripple as the shock settled in. What had just unfolded was no ordinary confrontation. It was a lesson, one that none of them would forget. The spark had been lit, and its flames would burn in their memory long after lunch was over. The mess hall was frozen. Every soldier present, from the privates fresh out of basic to the seasoned sergeants with years of deployments, had gone completely silent. Forks hovered mid-air, conversations hung unfinished, and the constant din of laughter and chatter had died in an instant. It was as if the entire building was holding its breath, watching Lieutenant Commander Sarah Blake with a mixture of shock and awe. Daniels, the ringleader of the young soldiers, stumbled backward from the table, clutching his wrist. His face burned crimson, a cocktail of embarrassment, shock, and the sting of his pride shattering into pieces. His buddies, who only moments ago had been puffing their chests and cackling at his jokes, now looked like statues. Their bravado had drained from them like water through a sieve. None of them dared move. Sarah, calm as though nothing out of the ordinary had occurred, simply adjusted the sleeve of her uniform and looked down at Daniels with steady eyes. There was no anger in her expression, no malice. Only control, precise, unshakable control. The silence stretched on until one of the younger soldiers, Harper, broke it with a nervous stammer. What the hell was that? His voice cracked, and the question wasn't only for Daniels. It was for everyone in the room, a desperate attempt to make sense of the blur that had unfolded before them. Daniels tried to regain his composure, straightening his uniform and forcing a weak laugh. She just got lucky. That's all. His voice lacked conviction. He wanted his friends to believe it, but even he didn't. The memory of her speed, the way she had taken control of him, in less than a second, still pulsed painfully through his arm. Sarah, unfazed by his weak attempt at saving face, leaned forward ever so slightly, resting her palms on the table. Her voice, calm and level, carried across the room with ease. Lucky doesn't look like this. Before Daniels or anyone else could respond, she moved again. This time, it wasn't just Daniels who felt the sting of her precision. In a single fluid motion, Sarah stepped around the table, closing the distance between herself and Daniels' three friends. Her movements were like water, flowing, seamless, unstoppable. Harper reached out instinctively to block her path, but in less than a heartbeat, his arm was redirected, twisted outward as Sarah shifted her stance and swept his legs from under him. He landed hard on the tile floor, his breath exploding from his lungs in a shocked grunt. The second soldier, Torres, lunged forward in a panic, but Sarah pivoted, caught him by the collar, and used his own momentum to guide him forward until he toppled against the nearest chair. the wooden frame splintering under the impact. The third, a stocky recruit named Collins, froze for half a second too long, his instincts warring with his fear. By the time he threw a desperate punch, Sarah had already sidestepped. She caught his wrist mid-swing, applied a subtle twist, and suddenly he was on his knees, groaning, staring up at her in disbelief. All of it happened in less than 5 seconds. Gasps erupted across the mess hall. A spoon clattered to the floor from someone watching in the back. For those who hadn't been close enough to see her initial takedown of Daniels, the demonstration was undeniable now. They weren't watching a lucky move. They weren't watching some average soldier defending herself. They were witnessing mastery, the kind of skill only found in the rarest warriors the military had to offer. Sarah didn't hold Collins long. She released his wrist with the same control she had shown earlier, stepping back, her expression unreadable. "Get up," she said evenly, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. Collins obeyed instantly, rubbing his wrist, his earlier bravado nowhere to be found. Harper was still on the ground, struggling to catch his breath, and Torres was pulling himself from the broken chair, cheeks red with shame. Daniels stood there frozen, torn between rushing to their defense and recognizing the futility of doing so. Sarah turned back to him, her gaze sharp but steady. She spoke softly, but every ear in the hall caught her words. "You wanted proof of what I'm doing here. You just got it." The weight of her statement hung in the air like a hammer ready to fall. Daniels swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. He had wanted to humiliate her in front of an audience, to turn her into the butt of his jokes. Instead, it was he and his friends standing exposed, their weakness laid bare for everyone to see. But Sarah wasn't finished. She stepped forward, her boots clicking softly against the tile. With every measured step, Daniels felt smaller. She stopped only inches away, her eyes locking onto his with unshakable intensity. "Combat," she said, her tone low and deliberate, "is not a game. You don't corner people because you think it's funny. You don't test limits you don't understand. Out there, beyond these walls, arrogance gets you killed." She let the words hang, then added with a cold finality, "Or worse, it gets someone else killed." Daniels lowered his gaze, unable to hold her stare any longer. His pride screamed at him to fight back, to restore the shred of authority he thought he had over his friends. But every instinct told him not to. Deep down, he knew the truth. If she had wanted to, she could have left him lying broken on the floor like the others. Sarah didn't gloat. She didn't smirk or raise her voice in triumph. Instead, she simply turned away, leaving Daniels to wrestle with his shame. She retrieved her tray, sat back down, and picked up her fork as though nothing had happened. The hall, however, was not so quick to return to normal. Whispers spread like wildfire, soldiers murmuring to one another, their eyes flicking between Sarah and the 4 chastened recruits. What had just unfolded wasn't a fight. It wasn't even close. It was a demonstration, precise, efficient, and unforgettable. Daniels finally spoke, his voice quiet, almost broken. Who are you?" Sarah didn't look up from her tray. She took another bite, chewed, swallowed, and only then answered. Her tone was even, without pride or arrogance, only fact. "Lieutenant Commander Sarah Blake," she said. "United States Navy SEAL." The mess hall erupted in hushed exclamations. Soldiers turned to each other in disbelief. Some muttered in awe, others shook their heads, embarrassed that they hadn't recognized her sooner. Daniels and his friends stood stunned, their faces drained of color as the weight of the revelation crushed them. They hadn't just picked a fight with someone tougher than them. They had picked a fight with one of the most elite warriors in the world. Sarah ignored the whispers. She didn't care for their awe or their judgment. For her, it wasn't about proving herself. It was about teaching a lesson that needed to be learned. And judging by the silence and the stares around her, that lesson had landed. The demonstration was over. But its impact would linger long after the trays were cleared, and the soldiers returned to their duties. The silence that followed Sarah Blake's words was not an ordinary pause. It was a silence that pressed down on every chest in the room, that made every soldier present suddenly aware of their own breathing, of the pounding of their own hearts. The mess hall, normally filled with noise and laughter, had become a place where even the clink of a spoon seemed deafening. Her words hung in the air like a hammer suspended above an anvil. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Blake, United States Navy SEAL. For some of the younger recruits, the name itself didn't mean much. They had only just begun their service, and their world was still limited to drills, shouted orders, and the dull repetition of training. But for others, those who had been around longer, those who had heard whispers and rumors of certain names in classified reports, Sarah Blake's identity struck like lightning. The very idea of a Navy SEAL sitting quietly among them was startling enough. But a woman? A woman who had survived Hell Week, drown-proofing, combat deployments, and missions where hesitation meant death. That was almost unthinkable. Daniels, the ringleader of the 4 young soldiers who had mocked her, stood frozen in place. The smirk that had once curled his lips was gone, replaced with a rigid mask of disbelief. He felt his stomach twist, and for the first time in years, he was truly speechless. His friends, who had fed off his arrogance, now looked like lost children. The swagger and laughter that had filled them minutes before had evaporated, leaving only shame and fear behind. They had thought they were cornering someone weak, someone easy to toy with, and now they realized they had been prodding at a predator all along. Around the hall, hushed voices began to stir. Soldiers leaned in close to one another, whispering urgently. "Did she say SEAL?" Someone muttered near the back. Another replied, "No way. That can't be real." A sergeant at one table shook his head, his eyes wide. "I've heard her name before. Blake. She was in Ramadi. Took a block with only 2 men at her side." Someone else whispered, "I thought she was a story. Some legend they told us in training. Whether the rumors were accurate or not didn't matter. The truth was undeniable. She was here, and they had seen her skill firsthand." Daniels tried to speak, to salvage what little pride he had left. His mouth was dry, and the words scraped painfully from his throat. You're lying," he managed, though even he didn't believe it. His friends glanced at him, their faces betraying their doubt. They wanted him to fix this, to explain it away, but he could barely stand under the weight of her gaze. Sarah didn't raise her voice or lash out. She simply looked at him, calm and steady, and replied, "If you think I'm lying, ask your commanding officer." The certainty in her tone crushed the last of his denial. He knew she wasn't bluffing. Every instinct screamed at him that this was real, and that he had been a fool. His chest tightened as his confidence crumbled. One of his friends, Torres, swallowed hard and muttered, almost without realizing it, "Sir?" It wasn't directed at Daniels. It was instinctively directed at Sarah. Collins, the stocky one of the group, shook his head and whispered hoarsely, "This isn't possible. Women can't be SEALs." His statement was quickly met with sharp glares from others nearby. A corporal at the next table barked at him, "Don't be an idiot." They said the same thing about women flying jets, about rangers, about combat roles. Times change, and she's standing right in front of you. Colin's mouth snapped shut. His face burned red, this time not from pride, but from humiliation. Sarah remained still, her calm more unnerving than any outburst could have been. She set down her fork again, wiped her mouth with a napkin, and looked not just at Daniels and his friends, but at the entire room. When she spoke, her voice was low and steady, yet it carried effortlessly to every corner of the hall. "You think you understand strength because you're loud," she said. "Because you stand in groups and corner people who sit alone. But that isn't strength. That's weakness disguised as pride." Every soldier present felt her words sink into their bones. They weren't just for Daniels and his friends. They were for everyone. "Out there," she continued, nodding toward the training fields beyond the windows. "There are no corners. There are no safe crowds to laugh with. Out there, it's just you, your training, and the people beside you. And if you carry arrogance into battle, it won't be your pride that suffers. It'll be your team. Someone else will pay the price for your foolishness." The mess hall was so quiet now that even the kitchen staff had stopped moving, their heads poking out from the doorway to listen. Daniels felt the words cut through him, sharper than the hold she'd pinned him with minutes earlier. He thought of his father, who had pushed him into the army, who demanded he prove himself at every turn. He thought of the pride he had tried so desperately to project, the leadership he had tried to fake. But what had he proven today? That he could mock someone who had seen more war in a year than he might in his lifetime? That he could lead his friends straight into humiliation? He wanted to apologize, but the words caught in his throat. His pride fought against it, even as his body screamed for release from the shame. He lowered his gaze, unable to hold hers any longer. Around him, whispers spread again, growing louder now. A young private muttered, "That's the woman who pulled 2 wounded Marines out of Fallujah, carried one over her shoulders, and dragged the other." Another soldier added, "I heard she swam 3 miles with a broken rib in training. They thought she'd quit, but she didn't." The story spread like wildfire. Whether true or exaggerated didn't matter. Her legend had taken root, and Daniels and his friends had just been the unlucky ones to challenge it. Sarah let the murmurs rise before speaking again, this time softer, but with an edge that made every word bite. "You don't have to like me, but you will respect me. And more importantly, you will respect the uniform. Because the day you forget, that is the day you stop being soldiers." Her words struck like a blade, clean and merciless. When she finally picked up her tray again and returned to her meal, the spell broke. Conversations resumed, though they were hushed and subdued. No one dared laugh too loudly. The mess hall that had once been filled with arrogant chatter now felt heavy with humility. Daniels and his friends remained standing awkwardly for a moment longer before finally sinking into their seats, their pride in tatters. They ate in silence, their food tasteless in their mouths. Daniel's hands shook slightly as he lifted his fork. He couldn't look at anyone. The mess hall, which had once felt like his stage, now felt like a cage. Every whisper felt like it was about him. And it was. He had gone from leader to fool in the space of 10 minutes. His ears burned with humiliation, but worse than that was the realization gnawing at his chest. For the first time since joining the army, Daniels wasn't thinking about proving himself. He wasn't thinking about impressing his friends or living up to some image of toughness. He was thinking about survival, about the cold truth that arrogance would get him killed if he carried it past these walls. And as Sarah Blake calmly finished her meal, ignoring the weight of eyes still fixed on her, Daniels understood something he had never considered before. He wasn't ready. None of them were. The revelation had struck. The arrogance was gone. But the lesson he knew was only just beginning. The mess hall's tension lingered long after Sarah Blake had spoken her last word. Soldiers who had moments before been laughing and careless now picked at their trays in silence, their eyes darting toward her, and then quickly away, as if looking too long might expose their own insecurity. Sarah herself remained calm, eating with the same deliberate pace she had before the confrontation. It was as though nothing had happened, as though she had not just dismantled 4 cocky young men in front of an entire company. That composure only deepened the sense of awe that now surrounded her. Daniels sat stiff in his chair, his fork untouched. Every so often his eyes flicked toward Sarah, but he couldn't meet her gaze for long. His shame felt unbearable. He had come into the hall feeling like a leader, someone admired by his peers, someone destined to rise quickly through the ranks. Now, after only a few minutes, he felt exposed, stripped of the armor of arrogance he had worn so comfortably. His friends sat equally quiet. Torres pushed his food around without eating. Collins kept his hands pressed together on the table as though in prayer, and the fourth, Miller, stared down at his tray as if it might offer an escape. The silence was broken when the doors to the mess hall opened. A figure entered, a tall captain with graying hair and a presence that immediately commanded respect. Conversations fell quieter still, and chairs shifted as soldiers instinctively straightened in their seats. Captain Harris had arrived. He was a man of few words, but when he spoke, his voice carried like iron. He scanned the room, noting the unusual quiet, then turned his eyes toward Sarah. "Lieutenant Commander Blake," he said, his tone acknowledging her without needing explanation. Every soldier in the hall stiffened. The title confirmed what many had already begun to suspect, but had not dared to believe. Daniels felt his heart lurch painfully. This wasn't some bluff. This wasn't some exaggerated rumor. It was official, acknowledged openly by their captain. Sarah gave a curt nod. "Captain." Harris's eyes swept the hall once more, then rested on Daniels and his group. He didn't need anyone to tell him what had transpired. The shame on their faces, the whispers he'd overheard before stepping inside, and the collective weight in the room told him everything he needed to know. He sighed quietly, not in anger but in disappointment, the kind that cut far deeper. "Stand up," he ordered. Daniels and his friends rose instantly, their movements stiff. They felt as though every pair of eyes in the hall was burning into them. Harris studied them for a long moment before speaking again. "You thought you'd test someone you didn't understand. You thought mocking, horroring, and laughing made you strong. You thought you could measure yourselves against a ghost you've only heard whispers about." His words were slow, deliberate. He turned his gaze briefly toward Sarah before continuing. "And you found out just how wrong you were." The four young men stood frozen, their shame carved into their faces. Harris stepped closer, his boots striking against the floor with the rhythm of judgment. "Do you know why she didn't destroy you just now?" he asked, his voice like a blade. "Because she doesn't need to. Her record speaks louder than anything she could do here. You're lucky she chose restraint, because I assure you, on the battlefield mockery gets no mercy." Daniels felt the words pierce through him, harder even than Sarah's earlier speech. His body was rigid, but inside he was unraveling. Harris let the silence stretch before addressing the entire hall. "Listen carefully, all of you. Respect isn't given because of age, gender, or rank. Respect is earned by sacrifice, by discipline, by actions under fire. Lieutenant Commander Blake has earned more respect than any of you can currently comprehend. She has carried men twice her size through gunfire. She has swum miles with her gear while injured. She has completed missions that most of you will never even hear about. And here you sit, doubting her because you cannot see past your own ignorance." A ripple of guilt washed through the room. Soldiers who had not even been involved in the confrontation bowed their heads slightly. The weight of truth was heavy, and it pressed on all of them. Sarah remained seated, her posture steady. She had not asked for this defense, but she understood the necessity of it. Harris was not only correcting Daniels and his friends, but sending a message to everyone present. Daniels' chest heaved with restrained breath. He wanted desperately to sink into the floor. His friends shifted uncomfortably beside him, their shame just as palpable. Finally, Harris fixed his gaze on him directly. "What do you have to say, soldier?" Daniels opened his mouth, but no words came. His throat constricted, his pride battling his conscience. For a long moment, the hall held its breath. Then finally, his voice emerged, hoarse and unsteady. I was wrong, sir." The words felt jagged in his mouth, but once spoken, they spilled more easily. "I disrespected the uniform. I disrespected her. And I disrespected myself." He swallowed hard, his eyes stinging with humiliation. "I'm sorry." Harris nodded once, his face unreadable. "Apologies are a start, but actions will decide if you mean it." He looked over the four of them. "You'll spend the next week assisting with every duty Lieutenant Commander Blake assigns. If she tells you to scrub floors, you scrub them. If she tells you to run until your legs give out, you run. You will listen, you will learn, and you will show respect, not with words, but with effort. Understood?" "Yes, sir," the four muttered in unison, their voices weak but sincere. The captain turned back to the hall. "And the rest of you remember this. Arrogance is poison in the field. It kills faster than bullets. The only thing that keeps you alive out there is trust. Trust in your training, trust in your brothers and sisters beside you, and trust in those who've proven themselves when it mattered. Never forget that." With that, Harris left, his presence fading, but his words lingering like smoke. The mess hall remained subdued, the weight of the moment sinking deeper with each second. Sarah finally finished her meal, rising from her seat with quiet dignity. As she passed Daniels and his friends, she paused briefly. She didn't sneer, didn't mock, didn't even scold. She simply looked at them, her expression unreadable, and said, "You'll understand one day why this matters. Don't wait until it's too late." Then she walked away, her boots striking softly against the floor, leaving behind a silence thicker than before. Daniels and his friends sank back into their seats, their punishment already begun not in labor, but in the sting of humility. The rest of the soldiers returned to their meals, but the atmosphere had changed. The lesson was not just for the four who had mocked her. It was for all of them. That day in the mess hall became a story that spread throughout the base, retold in barracks, and whispered on training fields. And as the legend of Sarah Blake grew, so did the understanding among those who had witnessed it. Respect was not about who you thought you could corner. It was about who had already proven themselves when it mattered most. The days that followed in the barracks were quieter than anyone expected. The four young soldiers who had cornered Sarah Blake moved with a new caution, their heads down, their steps lighter, almost as if the weight of humiliation had pressed into their bones. Daniels, the ringleader, found himself replaying every second of the mess hall encounter in his mind, over and over. The swiftness of her actions, the calmness in her voice, the control she wielded effortlessly, it haunted him. He realized that what he had thought of as arrogance or legend was far more than that. It was experience, discipline, and a level of skill most could never even dream of attaining. Harper, Torres, Collins, and Miller were assigned to work under her supervision, as Captain Harris had instructed. At first, it was small tasks: organizing gear, cleaning training areas, assisting with administrative duties. But Sarah treated each task as an opportunity to teach them more than just discipline. She used the routine chores to show them the importance of attention to detail, the value of persistence, and the necessity of staying composed under pressure. Every instruction came with an expectation. Every expectation carried weight, and every mistake earned a quiet, corrective lesson rather than angry reprimand. By the second day, it became clear that this was not just about punishment. Sarah wanted to instill understanding. The young soldiers began to notice the subtle ways she moved, the care she took in everything, the thought she put into planning even the smallest action. When they observed her loading weapons, her hands moved with precision and fluidity that made them feel clumsy and untrained. When she walked through the training field, her eyes scanned every corner, every potential hazard, and every soldier's movements, anticipating outcomes they hadn't yet considered. She was not just a warrior. She was a teacher in motion, and every moment with her was a lesson in awareness and preparation. Daniels found himself struggling the most. He had spent years believing that toughness was shown through loudness, through bravado, through leading others with an exaggerated confidence. Sarah had shown him that toughness was silent, measured, and unwavering. He remembered the look in her eyes when she had spoken to him in the mess hall, calm but cutting, filled with the understanding that actions had consequences and that weakness was not tolerated. Over the following days, he found himself watching her carefully, mimicking her techniques, learning from her subtle guidance. The fear that had first gripped him became a motivator, driving him to push beyond what he thought possible. One evening, after a long day of physical drills, cleaning, and carrying out Sarah's instructions, Daniel sat alone on the edge of the training field. The sky was tinged with the orange and purple of sunset, casting long shadows across the ground. His friends were scattered nearby, tired and quiet, reflecting their own lessons learned. Daniel stared at the horizon, his mind replaying the events of the mess hall over and over. He realized that what he had initially thought of as humiliation had been a gift. Sarah had not just humbled them. She had opened their eyes to what it meant to serve with honor, to respect skill and experience, and to understand the weight of responsibility they carried as soldiers. It wasn't easy. Every day brought new challenges, new small corrections from Sarah, and occasional demonstrations that reminded them they were still learning. But with each correction, Daniels felt a shift inside him. He was beginning to understand that respect was earned through effort and humility. That leadership was about more than being the loudest in the room. And that courage was measured not by bravado, but by the strength to face one's mistakes and learn from them. Word of Sarah's confrontation spread across the base, growing into a story that transcended gossip. Soldiers began to whisper about the Navy SEAL who had effortlessly taken down 4 arrogant young men in the mess hall. Some recounted the precision of her movements. Others spoke of her calm authority and the way she had commanded respect without raising her voice. The story became legend, not because of her physical prowess alone, but because it carried a lesson that every soldier could carry with them: strength tempered by wisdom, discipline guiding action, and respect earned through capability and restraint. By the end of the week, Daniels and his friends had changed in ways that were subtle but undeniable. Harper moved with more confidence yet less arrogance. Torres learned to listen before acting. Collins accepted guidance without resentment. And Miller understood the value of humility. They no longer sought attention or validation from peers. Instead, they focused on improving themselves, quietly observing and emulating Sarah whenever possible. Daniels, in particular, felt a deep transformation. He no longer measured himself by how loudly he could command others, but by how effectively he could act, how prepared he was, and how well he could anticipate outcomes in training exercises. Sarah Blake, in the meantime, continued her routine without fanfare. To those who didn't know her, she appeared as just another officer quietly fulfilling her duties. But those who had witnessed the mess hall incident, or who had been close enough to her supervision, knew differently. She was a living lesson in discipline, skill, and respect, and her presence changed the way soldiers thought about themselves and their capabilities. One afternoon, as the 4 young soldiers were carrying out another of Sarah's instructions, Daniels paused and looked at her, finally able to meet her gaze without fear or shame. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "thank you for showing us the truth." His voice carried sincerity, a stark contrast to the arrogance he had displayed just a week earlier. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, then gave a slight nod. acknowledging his words without embellishment. She didn't need praise or recognition. She had achieved something far more important. She had planted understanding and respect in minds that needed it most. Weeks passed, and life on the base settled back into routine. Daniels and his friends continued to work under Sarah's guidance, but their transformation had been solidified. They carried themselves with a quieter confidence, their respect for skill and authority deeply ingrained. The mess hall incident became a touchstone story, retold as a lesson in humility, discipline, and the importance of understanding the capabilities of others before testing them. New soldiers arriving on base would hear whispers about the SEAL who had humbly demonstrated unmatched skill and authority, setting the standard for what true strength looked like. And as for Sarah Blake, she continued her work without seeking acknowledgement. Her legacy wasn't in stories or legends. It was in the subtle, profound change she inspired in those around her. She had taught that strength was not measured in arrogance or volume, but in action, restraint, and respect. In one quiet week, she had turned 4 arrogant soldiers into students of discipline and left an indelible impression on an entire company. The lesson endured far beyond the walls of the mess hall. For Daniels, Harper, Torres, and Collins, the memory of that day and the calm authority of Sarah Blake became a guiding force in everything they did. They carried her example with them into training exercises, into field missions, and into every interaction with others who underestimated them or themselves. What had begun as humiliation had transformed into enlightenment, and in the quiet moments of reflection, each of them knew that they had been given an opportunity that few ever received, a chance to learn from someone truly extraordinary. Even years later, the story of that mess hall confrontation would be told on the base, not as a tale of intimidation or fear, but as a story of mastery, humility, and the unshakable strength of a Navy SEAL who, with calm precision, had changed the lives of 4 young soldiers forever. And for those who remembered that day, the lesson remained crystal clear. Never judge the quiet one, never underestimate experience, and never forget that respect is earned, not demanded.